If Jesus really was condemned to die for claiming to be God, how exactly do we explain his final words on the cross? In Mark 15:34 we read, "At 3 o'clock Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And on the face of it, this strikes us as rather strange. How could Jesus cry out to God for forsaking him if Jesus himself is divine? Now, Christians have attempted to theologically reconcile this with the doctrine of the Incarnation in a number of different ways that are beyond the scope of this video, but what I want to argue for here is that this statement made by Jesus makes a lot of sense in light of the Jewish context. Any first century Jew would know that Jesus was quoting the 22nd Psalm, which starts off by saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was actually quite common in early Judaism to invoke a complete psalm. Simply by quoting the opening line, we actually see this in the Mishnah. Now, to understand why Jesus quoted the first line of Psalm 22, we need to go back and read the entire psalm. For starters, Psalm 22 is a song of faith that God will save his suffering servant despite the appearance that God abandoned him. And the psalm says right after the opening bars that Israel's fathers trusted in God and were saved. And verse 24 specifically affirms that God did not turn away from the psalmist's suffering, for it reads, "For he did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted, he did not hide his face from me, but heard when I cried to him." More importantly, Psalm 22 is credited to King David, who was writing 1,000 years before Christ. But the psalm really does not fit the David was having a rough day interpretation. David never experienced some of the events described in the psalm. In view of the fact that it sounds eerily like a crucifixion scene, it's not hard to see why Jesus would quote this as a prophecy of his death. Let's take a look at a few of the passages here. It says, "For I am poured out like water, all my bones are out of joint, my heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me, the congregation of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count on my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Now, some counter-apologists claim that Christian translators twisted the verse regarding the piercing of hands and feet, but that's not entirely true. The Greek Septuagint, which predates Jesus, clearly states they have gouged my hands and my feet. At the very least, these lines describe someone whose feet and hands have been seriously injured. The passage also describes somebody who is naked, exposed to the public gaze, and mocked. Disjointed bones would definitely be the effects of a crucifixion victim, and they would also be exhausted and dehydrated. Being poured out like water means that they'd be bleeding out. Each of these scenes seem to recall something that happened during Jesus' crucifixion. And Psalm 22:18 gets very specific when it speaks about soldiers casting lots over Jesus' clothing. Justinian's Digest records that the clothing and small valuables possessed by prisoners were forfeited to the executioner and his assistants. John claims to be a witness of the crucifixion and describes the event in vivid, realistic detail. Let's take a look. He writes, "When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, 'Let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it.' 4 Roman soldiers, calloused at the horror of crucifixion, divided Jesus' clothes in the fairest way that they knew. A quaternion of Jesus' executioners casting lots of his garment doesn't seem to fit with anything that we know about King David, and according to some, this was invented to fit Psalm 22, but there's nothing really particularly miraculous about it. This particular verse wasn't considered to be messianic by the rabbis, and as I've argued in other videos, there are multiple reasons to believe that the Gospels are reliable. Last but not least, while Psalm 22 begins with David's experience of feeling abandoned by God, it ends with the conversion of the heathen nations and the coming of God's kingdom. Here is part of how the psalm concludes. It reads, "All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations." Now let's think about the progression of this psalm. It starts off with the persecution and execution of Israel's king, and in the end, pagan nations are miraculously converted to worship the God of Israel. This begins when a Roman centurion witnesses Jesus' death and calls him God's son. We read this in Mark 15:39. Jesus' cry on the cross doesn't prove that he died as a failure, but that he viewed his death as the victory of the God of Israel. The God of the Jews is now worshipped by literally billions of Gentiles today. We have to ask, when exactly did this start? The answer is simple, with the death of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, how could this passage apply to King David? King David died peacefully as an old man in the arms of Abishag the Shunammite, and even the 11th century Jewish commentator Rashi applied these sufferings to the Jews in exile. Here's what Rashi had to say. He writes, "They, meaning the people of Israel, are destined to go into exile, and David recited this prayer for the future." So Rashi seems to think that this psalm applies to something that hasn't happened yet. But it seems clear from this passage that this psalm is referring to an individual. The Jewish exile certainly did not lead to the conversion of pagan nations either, and even other rabbinic midrash applied this passage to a future messianic figure referred to as Ephraim, seeing that this applied neither to Israel in exile or King David. So who else's deliverance from extreme suffering and death was worthy of being repeatedly recounted before Israel's assembly? Is there any other individual's deliverance from extreme suffering or death worthy of worldwide attention to the point where nations turn to the God of Israel because of it? It seems pretty clear that Psalm 22 can only be fulfilled by the death and the resurrection of the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, the perfectly righteous one.